So far today, we have heard a number of very interesting presentations about what is meant by a knowledge economy, and in particular, how knowledge management occurs mainly in firms. What I want to do is to extend that a little bit and look at the question of how the gap, and I'll show that there is a gap, between those who generate knowledge about the knowledge economy, can convey that knowledge, or how it is communicated, with those who make policy, rather than management decisions, make policy in government departments. And I'm going to tell the story really very much based on my own experience. As Alan says, a number of years ago, I was the director in Sprue after Chris Freeman. And at that time, it happened to coincide with the time that Mrs. Thatcher was in office, and she didn't like the social sciences. She thought it was a waste of government money funding research in the social sciences, and she tried to bring about the demise of the Social Science Research Council, an organization for which we in Sprue derived quite a lot of funding. And unfortunately, she didn't succeed, but it meant that the research councils put a lot of pressure on those organizations, those research institutes, which were receiving money from the Economic and Social Research Council. They had to call it the Economic and Social Research Council because Mrs. Thatcher said there's no such thing as a social science, and it hence became the Economic and Social Research Council. And we were under pressure in Sprue to demonstrate that we were useful to the British economy and society, and that we were having an impact on British government policy. And we had to develop indicators of impact. Well, those of you who have been at this interface between policy research and policy making will know just how difficult it is to develop indicators. And when I got a sabbatical, and in those days we did get occasional sabbaticals in the universities, I decided to get the other side of the fence. Instead of being concerned with the knowledge push that all researchers want to see, I would find out what the demand side was by spending time with government policymakers and see how they reached out into the total body of knowledge in order to formulate knowledge-based policies where there was plenty of research evidence, and evidence was the key word. I was invited to spend most of the time I had on the sabbatical looking at this in Australia, but I also looked at it in Canada at provincial government level, and I've been doing quite a lot of work in China at the time, and the Chinese asked me to look at the link between policy research in science, technology, and innovation and decision-making at provincial government level in China. So I'm drawing on what I learned during that experience, and subsequently have been involved, interestingly enough, in the health sector, where there has been a lot of interest between health policy research and policy making, both in Canada and in Australia. That's the background, and I want first to summarize what I learned from the research push side, what policy researchers aim to do. I found there were really three categories of researchers. By far and away, the largest group, and in many ways these factors were most important for academics, there is the first group that involved in publishing academic papers and writing books. And that was absolutely crucial for their academic career. They would be judged for promotion based on their publications. And they did it in order to enhance their career, but also because many wanted to influence well, we'll use the word, since it's been used already this morning, the paradigm of whatever it was they're working on. In this case, innovation and the impact of science and technology. But also they published, because they would hope that somewhere, either when their publication first came out, and for the first few months of the publication of a journal, work that's in that journal is limelighted and people are well aware from it. But after a year, it sort of disappears into the archives. But at some point in the future, it may reappear and be picked up because it is absolutely relevant to a particular policy problem of the time. That whole process whereby knowledge is created and published disappears from view for a while and then re-emerges is often referred to as the limestone model of impact of policy research on policy. And that majority of people that I talked to in the research policy business fell into that first category. There are a few people, relatively few people, in that category of policy researchers who actually proactively wanted to influence public opinion and policy in addition to their publications. And they had a number of procedures for trying to get across their knowledge to the policy making. The first was that they would cultivate personal contacts with policymakers and their advisors. And I should also add there something that we found, that policymakers actually have access, usually pretty good access, to a range of policy researchers that are in the civil service. And so governments have access to knowledge generated by their civil servants, but people in the opposition parties don't. And therefore, when they are in opposition, they are more amenable to being influenced by academics. And the link between academic policy researchers and policymakers for the future when they're in opposition is very strong. I'll just give one quick anecdote about that particular point, drawn from my interviews in China. I was talking on one occasion with the director of the Science Technology Policy Research Center in the city of Shanghai. It was a municipally funded organization. And I asked the director of that institute, did he just publish papers, or did he in some way try to influence the policy with the knowledge that had been generated in that research institute? And he said, no, that is a very important issue. Yes, we must publish, there's no doubt about it. But if we have something really important to transmit, what I do is to, first of all, find out who is the key individual in government that I need to influence. It almost certainly won't be the minister. It'll be someone further down the organization or the ministry, but who has responsibility for the particular thing that I have new knowledge about. I identify who that is. I then find out what's their favorite food. Do they like Beijing cuisine, or is it Shanghai cuisine, a Sichuan cuisine, whatever. Find that out. Then I find out the best restaurant serving that type of food, and I invite the person to have lunch. Then the next challenge is to know when in the course of the hour, an hour and a half we have, I should introduce the knowledge which I want to really influence them with. And having decided on that, then I launch forth and tell them the story. And I mentioned this to some of the policy makers in the UK, and they said, actually, it's a very good idea. I tried to persuade Sprue to let me have a budget for entertainment, but never succeeded in that one. But anyway, that's that. The people in this category also write articles for newspapers and try and influence public opinion. They appear on television and radio and become the gurus, the people that are always consulted, and you get your own story in when you appear on those occasions. What we did in SPRU was to welcome the visit of policymakers to the department or research center. And in particular, part of our indicators, how many ministers had asked to come and visit SPRU during that year. Had they come with their officials or without them? How many trade union leaders had asked to come to be briefed in the course of that time? And as I said, we also developed indicators of policy impact. And then the third category are those people who have done all of those things so far, but really feel that they have this knowledge which should be at the heart of policy. They either serve on advisory committees to government, or in some instances transfer from academia to government departments, and sometimes back again, but they are fairly versatile in their employment situation. Well, that was the sort of general story from the researcher's point of view. I then interviewed a lot of policymakers and found that their requirements on the demand side are actually very different, in many ways, very different from what the supply side of the policy researchers have to say. And one of the first things that I discovered, and this was common in all of the countries, whether it was the UK, Canada, Australia, or China, was that the policymakers pointed out that there are different timelines along which they need knowledge and advice. There's the one day between the time that they are aware of a particular problem where they want knowledge, and so it has to be immediate. The second is that in many instances they said that they had about 3 weeks' notice between the time that they identified an issue and a problem and the time when they must have a solution for it. And then finally there's the 1 year plus. And they said that in many ways is the easiest because we can subcontract to a university department to do some knowledge, generate the knowledge on it. Or we can go to one of our science councils or innovation bodies. The second thing was that they were interested in knowledge and not information, and that's come through very clearly in the discussions we've had so far today. They are bombarded with information the whole time, and that is too much. It's a surfeit of information. They need knowledge. Now, it's interesting how they define knowledge. For them, and again, this was true across the different countries, for them, the knowledge was the information that is relevant to the decision and policy that they have to make. It's what is synthesized so it is relevant to their immediate needs. The third thing was that they needed to be able to trust the advice and the knowledge, the synthesis of the information, and it should come from authoritative sources of knowledge which they can trust. And that word trust came up every time that I had an interview. They were interested also sometimes in the generic, what's happening at a global level and what's specific to their own country. So both of those sorts of knowledge were required. And almost invariably, one would be asked by the policymakers how to access the knowledge relevant to their particular problem from other organizations and countries from around the world. And so some way in which that can succinctly be brought to the attention within the timelines that they have was a key issue. And finally, and this I think is becoming more important, the views of stakeholders to potential advice relating to whatever issue they're looking at. This is where the political considerations of policymaker come in. And for example, what are the views, how is this policy going to impact on the poor? What are the environmental implications of following this policy? What are the differential impact of the policies on lives of men and women, the gender dimension to it all? And how can one test the ideas which have come from the policy researchers and the synthesis of those ideas to different stakeholders? Well, it became clear that the supply side and the demand side for knowledge were not in harmony. They had different needs, the suppliers, the policy researchers, from the policy making community. There was some overlap, but it was haphazard. And it seemed that what was required was some form of intermediary, something that could take the information pertinent to the policymakers' problems and generate the knowledge relevant for those particular problems, and to do it in a timely way. And I found that within many countries, the word for those intermediaries became knowledge brokers. Now, some people didn't like the term knowledge broker, but that was basically what it was that they were. They were intermediaries. So I say, who are the knowledge brokers? They're the people who synthesize the knowledge, perhaps find the publication that was published 5 years ago by a particular researcher, and they then realize it's relevant. And there are many different types of these intermediaries, or these knowledge brokers. Very clear that the World Wide Web has made a world of difference to how people, particularly in the short term, the 1 day or the 3-week supply, can access knowledge. It's not necessarily from trusted sources, but it might be the best that's available. And I'm sure all of you have used, to your own advantage, Google. And I have here just a few examples, which I'm not going to have time to go into, but one of these was one that I've been very much involved with in helping to create, and that's the Science and Development Network, SciDev.net, and that is itself a website mainly staffed, the organization mainly staffed by science journalists who integrate the knowledge around particular policy issues. And this is at the generic side. It's not answering specific, country-specific issues. And then other organizations. I was involved in helping to develop the South African Green Paper on science and technology policy shortly after Mandela came to power. And we used the internet for linking the process of developing a green paper, or it could have been a white paper, with policy research groups spread around the world. And they were providing the inputs about what other countries have done about specific issues. But then government set up advisory committees, and also the academies of science all have advisory committees. A very important development in the UK has been the fact that now just about every government department have chief scientists. The chief scientists have their own network, and they can synthesize the knowledge. They can contact their colleagues for the 1 day. For 3 weeks, they also have their networks which they can rely on. I mentioned citizen juries here because increasingly there is a concern about, in decision making, the governments only really hear the view of the advanced scientists or people concerned with innovation. And there needs to be other mechanisms for distilling the experience and knowledge of some of these other stakeholders. And again, repeating them, it can be as broad as the poor, or it can be the gender dimension, or how does it affect the business community? There is next week here in this university a joint symposium with the Institute of Development Studies and the Science Policy Research Unit to address the issue of how advice from a wider range of people's experience can be brought to bear on policy making. And just finally, there's the 3 telephone solution. I remember talking to a minister of a province, a minister of industry in a province in Canada, and I was going through some of these intermediary approaches, and he said they're not necessary. All you need to do, he said, all I need to do to get the best possible advice about an issue is to make 3 telephone calls. The first one would be to someone in my local university that I personally know, and say it's a chemistry question. I say, this is my problem. Who is the most authoritative person in the world with knowledge about this issue? And he'll say, well, I'm not aware of exactly what you're talking about, but I know someone in the UK or elsewhere who probably would know. So I get their telephone number, make the second phone number, and they would say, well, it's in my general area, but the really top-notch person is this person, and give the telephone number. So he said in 3 telephone calls I can get through to the most authoritative voice on that particular issue. Okay, just in conclusion. Much of what I have said this afternoon is based on my own experience, and it's very anecdotal. I interviewed a lot of people, but I didn't have a structure. It wasn't what I would call really solid research. And I found that this is often the case, that there's a lot of anecdotal material about how you bridge the policy research community and the policy making community, and relatively little research. Also, what has become clear, people used to talk a lot about how you get integration and exchanges between the policy researchers and the policy makers. I would now add we have to do that and include the knowledge brokers, because they, I believe, are an essential part of the whole story. And we do it because there's increasing interest in how best to encourage evidence-based decision-making, but still recognizing that it is a political issue, and that has also to be taken into account. That, I told you, is the story. What I should have said at the very beginning is that my experience of the MENA region is largely in the 1970s, totally out of date to today's issues. And so I leave it to you to decide whether there is any relevance in that experience, and if so, what that relevance might be to the Middle East and North Africa. Well, thank you very much.